Okay, well, that worked not great at all. Hey guys, I'm not even sure how many people are here yet. I ran into some problems going live. My computer sort of hung up, so I had to restart a new session. I apologize for that. I'm going to give this a couple minutes just to let people sort of realize that I've gone live somewhere else, and hopefully this isn't too much of a dog of a session. So that wow, questions are already coming in. Holy geez, that's Lucas. Good question. I will come. You know what? I'm going to do a little presentation first. Just sort of what I think I want to do with these live sessions. This is the third one I think we've done. We'll do just a little conversation, so sort of some notes that I've taken down, some things I've been thinking about recently. And then we can sort of talk about that afterwards. We can talk, you guys can ask questions, whatever it happens to be. As I was saying, probably out there into the ether, the original link may not be working. I tried going live and it just sort of sat there. You get that spinning wheel of, we used to call it the wheel of death, but it's like I basically had to restart a new session. So I apologize if other people have been sitting and waiting in some other window, or maybe continuing to sit in some other window. Certainly was not the intention, computers being what they are. So yeah, that's oh, we do have somebody from New Zealand. That's I was getting messages from somebody in New Zealand complaining that 1 p.m. my time is 5 a.m. and I think they said like super early or something. So they were going to give it a pass, but I'm very glad that you're here. Thank you very much for joining. Dragonstorm, will we do the Bangladesh Liberation War? Yes, absolutely. There's a really interesting link between the Bangladesh Liberation War and Nixon going to China, actually, which obviously that all ties together, and you can't or shouldn't tell one story without telling the other. So yeah, we will absolutely be talking about that, but that's so much better than reading contracts. Whatever do you mean? Like, legalese can be so much fun on a Thursday at whatever time it happens to be, wherever you are. That sounds terrible, actually. I once upon had a job that involved like going through contracts, and it was like slow, painful death. So my my sympathies, I guess that's the word I'm looking for. So are we ever going to cover Canada in the Cold War? Canada in the Cold War? Canada participated in the Cold War? What are you talking about? It's nothing. There's nothing there. There's no stories. That's hey, ugly Christmas sweater? Absolutely ugly Christmas sweater. Like, it's a Mario sweater. This is the one time that I get to wear a sweater. I have a far more offensive sweater that I could have worn, but I figure I'm not going to do that because, why alienate half the people here? But I do have a really, really offensive Christmas sweater. So how did John F. Kennedy die? There was a bullet that went through his head. Plain and simple. That's okay. Here we are. So gave it a few minutes. Most pivotal. So basically, like, what I've been thinking about this for the last little bit, and there's been lots of reading that I've been doing and lots of work that I'm doing as part of some classwork, and everything sort of keeps coming back around to where I'm seeing there's this one key pivot moment that happens relatively close to what we term the start of the Cold War. We talked about periodization, sort of like what does the Cold War encompass? Like, when does it start? When does it end, etc. We talked about that briefly in the last live session that we did. But sort of the more conventional dates, sort of post Second World War to late 80s, early 90s, whatever you want to have that as the end point. In the early sort of like phase of that, there's one really key sort of swing moment, and it's the Korean War. And it's the Forgotten War, as it's known in a lot of places. It certainly isn't in a place like China. We actually did a video that like sort of looked pretty well in depth, sort of the Chinese view and the Chinese perspective of the Korean War. But overall, like the Korean War is really this massive, like huge turning point. So I took a couple of little notes here, just sort of so that I can get gives me a chance to get my thoughts together and make sure that when I start rambling that I'm not going to miss something or miss as few things as possible. I'm sure people will be more than happy to correct me. So pre-1950, like pre that July date where the North Koreans come storming across the DMZ, the situation, especially in the United States, you've got this environment. HUAC is really like coming into its own with McCarthyism. The atomic spy trials are like, sort of in full midst. Like there's definitely a bit of a communist scare that's happening. But the overall situation that you're seeing in the U.S. is that the U.S. military since 1945 had been cut and scaled way back. Like it went from, I really should have written down what the budget numbers were, but it's this massive cut, like cuts that happen across the board, and it's not just in one area of the U.S. military; it's across the board. And with that comes, and it's not just like, it's not a proportional like shrinkage that happens. It's across the board. Like the United States Air Force, created in 1946. I'm sure somebody will jump in and tell me and correct me, because you guys are great at that. When the U.S. Air Force is actually formed as an independent third branch of the military, it doesn't have mechanics. It doesn't have, it doesn't have like guys on the ground crews. It's not just lacking pilots. It's not just lacking newer planes. It's lacking everything, the infrastructure to be able to support all of that. And I don't mean lacking like a little bit. I mean like desperately short supply. As servicemen in at the end of the war in 1945, they just want to go home to their families. They and their friends, like they signed up for the duration, but once the duration had durated, they wanted to go home. They didn't want to hang out in the military. So the U.S. military has been cut way back, massive, deep budget cuts. There's inter-service within the military itself. There's inter-service rivalry. And a lot of the big example of that is between the United States Air Force and the U.S. Navy. And you sort of see that as this moment of real clarity that comes when the USS United States gets canceled. Basically it was like was to be the first super aircraft carrier. And it's not just that, it's like, should the Air Force hold primacy in the military hierarchy, or should the U.S. Navy, which, I mean, it's the oldest service, it saw itself as that, as the senior service. But there's strategic implications as well. How do you carry war to your enemies? Do you carry it by air? Do you carry it by sea? There's all these massive, it's like inter-service rivalries and conflicts that are happening. And budget's a really big thing too. Strategic Air Command was soaking up an absolutely massive amount of the budget in the late 40s. Early 1950, even by that point, there's no real clear decision on how to deal with communism, like globally. The United States has they really don't have a clear plan. The Truman Doctrine talks about containment. Yes, absolutely. It's George Kennan, the long telegram, Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs, all those things. But there's no real clear plan, like containment. It's a word. It's like, how do you do that? Do you do that with the limited ground troops that you have? Do you do that with nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons was sort of seen as like, well, okay, we've got them, nobody else does, so we'll just use the threat of those. And then, oh wait, sorry, the Soviets now have them. So there's this real soul-searching thing that's happening in early 1950. The military's got really fairly low investment in new hardware and new tech. That's all part of the budget cuts. There's plans on the drawing board. There's always plans on the drawing board. There is new technology that's being introduced, but it's certainly not what it was in 1944, and it's certainly not what it's going to be by the mid to the end of the 50s. But then you get something that's NSC 68, and NSC 68 is a document that was presented to the president, basically outlining that the U.S. was completely unprepared and completely unfit to be able to uphold the responsibilities and the duties that the United States was taking on by the late 40s and the early 50s. And it advocated for increased spending and just sort of increased more presence, more money to back everything up. And NSC 68 is, sort of, it's set to be debated and set to sort of go forward and have it sort of picked to pieces in a lot of places. And that's really what people were expecting to happen. Then the Korean War breaks out, and NSC 68 just gets passed. There's no debate, there's no discussion on it. And suddenly, okay, America's back at war. So the coffers open up, the treasury's pouring money back into the military and into military tech, all of these things. So NSC 68 ends up being this this key thing that I'm going to come back to in a second. The actual war. What is the war? What does the prosecution of the war itself show? The outbreak of the war, there's not enough troops. There's not enough gear. There's really poor logistics. There's bad intelligence. And this is very much focused in Asia. The situation in Europe is a little bit different. Not entirely so. I wouldn't say that it was the situation in Europe was great, but that was where the expectation, if there was going to be a war, that's where it was going to happen. A war on the Korean Peninsula was, nobody thought that was going to happen, except people who knew that it was going to happen and who were being ignored. But when it broke out, the U.S. really wasn't prepared for it in the slightest. There's the withdrawal back to the Busan pocket. There's the battle on Naktung. The massive landings at Incheon, MacArthur's drive to the Yalu, which results in basically the drive to the Yalu and then the longest retreat in U.S. military history, as the U.S. military gets basically 8th Army gets its ass handed to it, and they retreat all the way back south of where they started from. MacArthur's goes through all the advocating, wants to use nuclear weapons to take out Chinese supply depots on the north side of the Yalu. There's a political decision that nuclear weapons are not going to be used. MacArthur disobeys direct orders, is relieved, and is replaced by Matthew Ridgway, General Matthew Ridgway. Ridgway's a really interesting guy himself. I want to call him Iron Tits because that's what everyone else, that was his nickname. Probably didn't call that to his face. But Iron Tits Ridgway takes over. And right from the outset, he understands that he has to prosecute this war on limited means. He is not going to, China is off limits. Russia is off limits. They're declared no-go. Ridgway understands that, and that's how Ridgway decides that he needs to, that's how he prosecutes the war. That's how he moves forward with it. Spoiler alert, that's a really key understanding and a key sort of decision moment. Jet combat. The Korean War was the first place that you see jet combat. Strategic bombers at the time which in the Far East were almost, I don't want to say exclusively, but almost exclusively B-29s. Certainly in theater were B-29s still, so prop engine. Jets were those MiG-15s, were tearing them to pieces. The B-29s also had nothing to hit because North Korea, how do you strategically bomb a country that has nothing strategic left after the first 30 days? But then China enters the war, and China, which had the PRC, enters the war, and this is China. This is communist China's real entry into sort of the world stage. It's a combat-hardened army from the Civil War, but it's a style of combat that they weren't used to supplying themselves. They would pick up weapons from the Republic Army, from Republic of China Army, and then just use whatever they captured from retreating ROC troops in the Civil War. Suddenly, it's a very different style of combat that they suddenly have to undergo. But based on what they had, they actually equipped themselves quite well against a force that's only allowed to use limited force. China also enters the war not necessarily voluntarily. There's definitely pressure that's put on them to come into the war. There's the early strains between Beijing and Moscow. even with Stalin still alive. And that obviously like manifests itself later down the line with the Sino-Soviet split. So there's the first inklings that you start to see happen there. So that's sort of like, that's the situation during the war. What's the outcome? What are the big outcomes? And sort of this is where you sort of start seeing the pivot points. This is where the important things come out. Unlike previous wars that the U.S. had fought, the Korean War ends, and the U.S. doesn't draw down its military spending. It doesn't draw down its military readiness. It leaves itself in a wartime readiness posture, which is what lasts for the rest of the Cold War. It's recruiting and maintaining a standing army that would be ready to go immediately, as opposed to ready to be scaled up in the event of an emergency breaking out. So there's this immediacy that happens to it. U.S. attention is no longer focused exclusively on Europe. Like suddenly U.S. attention is drawn very heavily into Asia, obviously, because that's where Korea is. Spoiler alert. But U.S. attention is very much now focused on this realization that it isn't just Europe that you need to worry about. You know, that the U.S. and the West like has to be paying attention to what's happening everywhere else as well. The Korean War really defines and shows the U.S. how a war of containment is going to be fought. And it's not rollback. It's not rolling into North Korea and removing the government. It's maintaining the government of your ally and basically holding off like the other guy. It works in Korea. They try the same approach on a very high level. They use the same approach in Vietnam 15 years later, with very different results. Different war, different way of like fighting that war, different aims, lack of aims in some cases. But it's a very different war. But that sets the tone for what the U.S. thinks a war of containment should look like. The U.S. also makes the decision, and I'm not going to say it's a realization, it makes a political decision that nuclear weapons are not on the table to be used as part of a limited war. Certainly if an all-out war, like a direct war where the United States is directly attacked, yes, absolutely, nuclear weapons are still on the table, but nuclear weapons are not going to be used in a limited war, in wars of containment. That's sort of one of those takeaway moments, those takeaway points. And that's from Truman and from Eisenhower. It's across two administrations. That's an important distinction to make as well. So those are the really big points. There's a couple of like secondary points, and we've talked about this in other episodes, but Japanese economic recovery is very, very strongly and heavily linked to the Korean War. Our episode on that, looking at Japanese economic recovery, goes into the details on that, but there's definitely a very strong link that happens there. The West German economic recovery is actually linked back to the Korean War as well. One thing that I don't think a lot of people necessarily think about or realize is that North Korea actually makes the decision then to start pursuing policies of autarky, where they want to be able to stand as much as they can on their own 2 feet. And it sort of develops into juche and the weird ass cult of personality that is North Korea. But that's very much where that's born from, where they were so reliant on the Soviets and they were so reliant on the Chinese, and this realization that they need to be reliant on themselves, right or wrong. That's sort of one of those results and one of those takeaways that comes out of the Korean War. The PLA, the Chinese army, actually becomes a professional force from this. It's not a technological force, but it is a professional force. It's one that's going to have its own weapons. It's like all of that. It's a much more professionalized force by the end of the Korean War. It doesn't move away from, PLA doesn't really move away from human wave tactics and sort of this greater reliance on technology, starting till after the 1979 invasion of Vietnam and having their asses kicked there. But it very much starts after the Korean War. That's a much more technologically based, or not, shouldn't say, sorry, my apologies, not a technologically based, but a much more professional, formalized military force, as opposed to more guerrilla units. I can't read my writing there. One other little minor thing, and I think I mentioned this somewhere else, and I cannot for the life of me remember where I mentioned it, but a lot of U.S. weapons that were captured by the Chinese, which, I mean, there was a lot of U.S. hardware that was captured by the Chinese over the 3 years of fighting. It was taken and like given to the Viet Minh in North Vietnam or in French Indochina or whatever you want to call it. And the Viet Minh used U.S. weapons given to them by the Chinese that had been captured in Korea. They used that to beat the French. There was tube artillery that was used at Dien Bien Phu. That was American in origin coming from Korea. So it's one of those little weird little knock-on effects that happens in the Cold War. Interesting moments, anyways. So out of all of that, I mean, the big things for me, like this pivot, this change that happens, is the U.S. figures out like how they want to prosecute a policy of containment and military spending. The military spending that's ramped up massively starting from 1950 never goes back down again, which historically had been very unusual for the U.S. military. It even followed that, like, and keep in mind, like, the Cold War ends in 1989, 1991, whatever you want to call it. Let's say 1991, because I think that's largely the date that I've arrived at. Subject to people yelling at me that I'm wrong. But even like after 1991, the U.S. military started paring down and cutting down its the size of its army. Like, that's something that they did. That's following a very American tradition. The Cold War of having this large, ready-to-go standing army is not the way that the U.S. Army normally fights a war, and the way that the U.S. Army historically has ever been. And all of that stems from the Korean War. Like, the Korean War is sort of this real change moment, in terms of how everything changes, in terms of, and formalizes and solidifies in terms of how the Cold War is going to carry on. Until the eventual end of it in 1989, 1991, whatever you want to call it. So that's my little spiel. Lots of people, I'm sure, have different opinions, different ideas. It's history. There's always opinions. You can give a historian give 10 historians 10 facts, and you're going to get 10 different opinions, possibly even 12. That's just the way that history works. So it's very rare to have one true answer to something. So, especially to a complex and open-ended question like the pivotal moment of the Cold War. I mean, that's clickbait, and I'm guilty of clickbait. So thank you for clicking, and thank you for showing up. I'm done with my little spiel. Everybody clap, please. Thank you. There's 2 people out there clapping. But does anybody have any questions regarding anything that I've just... No, Andy, the dog's not dead. That's she's 3 people clapping. That's even better. 4. Holy jeez. That's the dog's asleep. I'm not let me see. Dog. But we're not. There's another dog over here as well, but he's also sleeping, and that's more people that want to come and look at the dog and want to listen to me talk. That's there we go. That's the internet. So, Corey Tobias, question: top book on the Sino-Soviet split. Lawrence Luthi is probably the single most current author that's written on the Sino-Soviet split. He's a prof at McGill University in Montreal. Excellent book. Definitely one of the definitive works, recent works on it. So yeah, Lawrence Luthi. Definitely go check that out. So, why did the Chinese join the Cold War? The Chinese joined the Cold War under pressure from the Soviets, because the North Koreans were getting their asses handed to them, but the Chinese were also scared that the Americans were going to cross the Yellow River into China. Don't forget that that's a regime that was, at that point, was about a year old, where they'd actually been in control. There was a great fear in Beijing that the U.S. was going to look at regime change in China to restore a more favorable government in Beijing, which the U.S. never had. U.S. never had real political plans to do that. Like military minds were thinking other things. There's certainly a political opposition group that wanted, like, the China First group that really wanted to sort of restore the old order back to China. But there wasn't any, that was never really on the cards, but that was the fear in Beijing. That's the big reason on why they joined in. But there was also pressure from the Soviets. So there's actually lots of questions going here. So if I have you done or will I do videos on the request for the Soviet Union to annex Bulgaria and Mongolia? We have looked at Bulgaria in the early 40s. That was one of the earlier videos that we did, the Sovietization of Bulgaria. But we haven't really done anything with it since. Mongolia is a really interesting topic, but Mongolia is a tough topic to come up with like enough good, reliable sources on. My Mongolian is terrible, believe it or not. All of my languages are terrible. You guys already know that. I'd like to do more on Mongolia just because I think it is a really interesting sort of unknown subject. But I personally am not ready to touch Mongolia as of yet, but I'd really like to. So, what else do we have here? Do I see the makings of a coming Sino-Russia split? Yeah. The Chinese and the Russians. I'm going to talk modern politics and move away from the Cold War for one quick second because I do this sometimes. The Chinese aren't allies of the Russians. Like Moscow and Beijing are not aligned together. There's a friendship of convenience that's there right now. But in my opinion, for Beijing, as soon as Moscow is more of a liability than it is a benefit, they're going to cut them loose and they're going to go their own way. I don't see anything beyond that. Will it be a frozen out split the way that we saw through the 60s, in the 70s, like in the 80s? I don't know. Like, I'm not a future prognosticator to that degree. I mean, there's 1,000,001 different ways that that wave can break. I have no idea. But I definitely think that don't ever kid yourself to think that Moscow and Beijing are buddy and that they're allies. They're not. That is a friendship of convenience, 100%. Were the troubles in Northern Ireland related to the Cold War and to the Soviets arm the PIRA? I don't know. If you'd have asked me this 4 years ago, I would have said that the troubles were independent of the Cold War, and that the Soviets weren't particularly involved with the PIRA. I don't think that from what I've seen and sort of like little hints at that I haven't had a chance to really dig into, the Soviets were funding in a very roundabout way the Republican movement. Keep in mind that, like, I'm assuming that if you're asking about the troubles, it's usually people who are Irish that ask about the troubles, and everybody else forgets about the troubles. But I mean, that's sectarian violence. That's hardcore religious as the reasoning behind it. I mean, whether it's actually religion that's driving that or not, that's a completely different. That's a whole other question. The Soviets weren't going to come right out and say, "Yep, we're funding the PIRA." But was that happening in a roundabout sort of like two or three middlemen kind of thing? Yeah, I absolutely think so. I think there's a lot of arms. Anything that can help destabilize and to distract the UK, which obviously was a major fundamental core NATO ally. Anything that they could do to do that they were going to do. We are going to be taking a look at the troubles at some point, and I'm sure I will say lots of offensive things to offend all kinds of different people. So look forward to that. And at that point, hopefully I get a bit more information. I can actually speak to that in a more, conclusive and concrete way. Soviets regarded China as a military threat. Yeah, they did. Absolutely. That was always, I mean, we did a video, we released a video 2-3 weeks ago on sort of the overview of the Sino-Soviet split, the impacts of the Sino-Soviet split. There was almost a nuclear war that happened over like Damansky Island, Zhenbao, in 1969. Like for real, like this was almost, there was almost a nuclear exchange over like that border. They are longtime rivals, going back to days of empire, like all of those things. That's China. Sino-Soviet relations are actually a really, really interesting topic. And again, that book by Lawrence Luthi is definitely, will get into all of that and sort of give a lot more detail. Do a video about 7 Days to the Rhine, about the insane Soviet plan to win the Cold War. Let's be honest, any plan to win the Cold War was fundamentally insane. The only way to any military plan to win the Cold War, they were all crazy. Whether you look at the American ones, like whether you look at the British sort of war plans, when you look at any of that, they're all just like absolutely nutso. And any of them that were sort of put down on paper, especially when it goes to the nuclear option, and things always go to the nuclear option because I think that's Clausewitz, where you always drive to use the most force possible. You're going to nuclear weapons, like that's going to happen. That's wild. That's crazy. It's will we do a video about it? Yeah, probably. Let's see. Did the World Anti-Communist League play a larger role in stoking conflict than is generally acknowledged? James, I couldn't answer that because I really don't know much about the World Anti-Communist League. I'm picking the question out because I think that's probably it's a good question. I don't want to toss an answer out on a subject that I don't know much about. I know I get up here once a week and sort of, it's like I've got my little pulpit and I get to talk, and everyone thinks that I know all kinds of things, and I know a little bit about a lot of things. There's a lot of things I really don't know a lot about, and that's actually one of them. I'm going to write that down though and see if I can figure out some more. So, let's see what else. I already talked about Bangladesh. We do a video on the Skopje earthquake in 1963. Connor, what could we do on the earthquake related to the Cold War? Tell me. Let's pop something into the comments. Let me know. Somebody, Dom Diggity, just yelling Vietnam. I'm assuming that's a request for us to start doing some videos on Vietnam, but I could be wrong. Could just be yelling Vietnam. I had some really good Vietnamese coffee the other week. That was I had it at 5:00 in the afternoon, which is a terrible idea because when you're an old man like me, it kept me up half the night. But at the time, totally worth it. So let's see. If the Soviets killed Osama bin Laden, what would the butterfly effect be? I don't know, Alex. That's a movie script or a book script. Write it up. Let's see. I don't, and I've talked about this. I think I talked about this on either the first, that really weird impromptu live stream that we did. I don't do a lot of counterfactual. I don't like counterfactual because I think counterfactual history very much turns into wish fulfillment. It just turns into this weird. I mean, wish fulfillment really is, I think, is the right word for it. But it always ignores the role of chance. I think counterfactual is a really interesting way of analyzing positions of everybody involved in a historical moment, to see what one step beyond that counterfactual might be. But as soon as you move beyond that, then it's like, in my opinion, I don't see the benefit to it because there's so many different permutations and combinations of things that could happen, that it really becomes an exercise in futility, unless you're, I'm just not a big fan of counterfactual for really sort of looking at like longer term things. Please talk about pro-African American nations during the Cold War. Mikhail, what do you mean? That's I'm curious. Like what? Who do you mean by pro-African American nations? Because I'm genuinely curious. I think that might be something really interesting for us to take a look at. Do I have any opinions on modern Russia seemingly try to regain old Soviet imperial territory? That's from Mac tonight. Yeah, I got lots of opinions on that. We've done lots of Q&As where I get to express my opinions on that. I don't. There's lots of speculation. Lots of people out there that are saying that Russia wants to put that Putin. I'm going to say Putin wants to put the USSR back together. I don't think that he wants to put the USSR back together. I think he's much more of an imperial irredentist. Like he's looking to put empire back together, whether it's the exact same shape and borders that the empire had or the USSR had, whatever. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think he's very much more imperial minded in his attitude towards the role and the place of Russia than he was Soviet. He may be a product of the Soviet system, but I think what he wants is that's much closer. I think of it more in terms of him trying to rebuild empire rather than rebuilding the Soviet Union. Not that the Soviet Union wasn't an empire. Not that. Anyways, we can go into Russian colonialism, like all those different types of things. There's so many different aspects that are being sort of dragged to light in the last 300 plus days. But yeah, that's a really interesting. There's going to be so many books. There's probably already a bunch of books already been written, but there's going to be so many more books on that over the coming decades. We are living through moments of history right now, like big important moments of history. Everything that's happening in Eastern Europe right now is important. This is big stuff. This isn't going to be a footnote. This is going to be pivot point. I don't know necessarily, but these are really important moments we're living through. We've been living through a lot of really important moments the last couple of years. I'm getting kind of tired, actually. Yeah, that's... Yeah. What, in my opinion, is the best factual movie about the Cold War? Factual. I mean, if you want to talk factual movies, you're talking documentaries. I think that's kind of a cop-out answer. But I think some of the best movies about the Cold War are not necessarily the ones that stick exclusively to the facts. It's nice when they do, as long as they're not contravening the facts and they're capturing like a zeitgeist, like the feeling of what 1960s Berlin was like. You're capturing the feeling of what life was like on a Soviet boomer. That's The Hunt for Red October. If you're capturing those little things, I'm a movie goer that isn't necessarily. I'm not the guy that's sitting there going like, it's like, oh my god, like, it's like, the webbing, like, that soldier's wearing is the wrong model for the year, blah 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 blah. I'm not the guy that's doing that, because I'm more than willing to suspend my disbelief. Willing suspension of disbelief. I'm much more willing to do that, provided that the zeitgeist and the feeling of a time period is being captured properly, and that there's, that's how I feel about movies. I'm not necessarily a nitpicker about super minor details or anything like that. Like the facts in a piece of fiction are important to a point, but telling a story as part of a movie or a book is really, really important. Unless you're claiming to be a documentary, in which case, try to get your facts right. We try. We don't always succeed. And I'll be the first one to admit it. You guys are the first ones to point it out, but I'm the first one to admit it. But yeah, like that's sort of where I sit with movies. So let's see. There's a whole lot of questions here. I'm just going to scroll back here for 1 second here. ABC Kevin, will we do a video on East German support for SWAPO in Namibia? We're going to be delving more into South African larger, like South Africa and Southern African history coming up. In terms of Namibia and Angola, between Cuban participation and, which everybody knows about, East German participation in places like Namibia, which is actually really interesting because of the old colonial links to Namibia, like all of these things, like these are really good stories to tell. So yeah, I mean, we definitely want to be getting into that. So that's have I read Foundations of Geopolitics by Alexander Dugin? No, I haven't. No, I haven't. That's I'm not a. Yeah, nope, I haven't. Orlando Figgis states that Russia's tragedy was it became an empire before having the chance to become a nation. Do I agree? I have to think about that because that's a big statement with a lot happening in it. And Orlando's probably, or Orlando is right. I think I agree. I agree with that, having heard that now. But I would need a chance to really sit and think about how to explain that and how to sort of articulate that. But it feels very, that feels right. Like, does that, if that makes sense to people? Yeah, that's Connor Lundeen commenting. Chernobyl was pretty good, not perfect factually, but good. Yeah, you know what? Chernobyl actually is a really good example of a piece of media that's telling a story and remains pretty true to the facts. They've taken some liberties there again because they want to tell a story and they want to tell a story in a specific way that it makes sense to people and doesn't get bogged down in the boredom and the mundanity, if that's even a word, whatever, like the mundane facts of everyday life. But yeah, I mean, like Chernobyl was excellent. I really, really enjoyed that. My wife and I watched that together, and it's pretty rare that we both watch a show, especially a modern show, that I want to watch, where she's just as engrossed as I am, and she absolutely was. So, for anybody who hasn't seen Chernobyl, take some time when you can and watch it. It is just phenomenal. Let's see. Do I think there was a huge difference between living standards between the communist countries in Eastern Europe? Yeah, there was. Especially going from this is a huge wide paintbrush that I'm about to paint with. The further east you went, the worse living standards seemed to get. Germany had like some of the highest living standards. Yugoslavia, Hungary, Poland, the farther east, the closer you got to the Soviet Union, and I'm not saying that that's the correlation there, but the closer you got to the Soviet Union, the worse living conditions seemed to be. There's a very wide, there absolutely was a gap and a gulf between living standards between the Soviet Union and the East Bloc countries in Europe. But even within the East Bloc nations themselves, not the Soviet Union, there was definitely a gaps, like differences in living standards. East Germans definitely had it better than the Poles did. The Hungarians had it better than the Romanians. And I mean, that has to do a lot often with internal policy. Romania, especially in the 80s, Romania was so focused on paying down the debt that it had taken out, in the 70s, that there was no spending on anything that was happening in the 80s. And that really impacted living standards, obviously. Other countries like Hungary, like East Germany, like Poland, like there was debt payments that were happening there that weren't so focused and so absorbing all of the dollars inside the budget. So there's definitely like different standards of living. It's a really interesting question. That's hard to quantify, because it's like, is my panelhaz better than your, it's I can't think of the German word for it. Somebody help me out. The German, the Stalin's concrete living blocks. I can't think of what the Germans called them. It was a panelhaz in Hungary, but is that the Hungarian panelhaz better than the one that was in East Germany? I mean, they're all the same. I've been in those in various different countries, and they're all kind of the same. So yeah, I mean but it's like, does the elevator work more in the East German ones than it did in the Hungarian ones? I'm assuming that they all worked better than they did in the Soviet ones. Hochhaus, is that really, Adam? That's I'm not doubting you. That's not the word that I was thinking of. Plattenbau. Thank you, Bill. That's perfect. That's Plattenbau is the word that I'm thinking of. Yeah, that's they all look the same. Like, the inside, they're all based on the same plans. Scheisse house. Well, it's depends if the elevator's working or not. You live on the 20th floor, but yeah, let's see. I'm going to go back here, roll through. I don't know if I've answered that question to anybody's satisfaction, but that's just sort of how I see things. Oh, Connor, that answer. The earthquake in Skopje was a big moment for the USSR and the United States because they worked together. Huh. That's a topic I'm going to take note of, Connor. Thank you. It's just for anybody he was the follow up on my question about the Skopje earthquake. The earthquake in Skopje was a big moment for the USSR and USA because they worked together. A big moment for warmer relations, especially how quickly it came after the missile crisis. That is really interesting, actually. That might be. Yeah, I'm going to take note of that. Thank you. That's. What Eastern Bloc country would I live in if I had to? Josh, I would live in any of them. Like I've lived in Hungary. I lived there for 4 years. And I loved it. I thought that was a long time ago. Things have changed. Some things for the better, some things maybe not. I'd live in any. I can live anywhere. Give me an internet connection, and I can live anywhere. I'm a homebody. I don't like going out. I'm not a big fan of people necessarily and interacting with crowds and groups of people I don't know. So could I live somewhere? Sure, no problem. I'm just going to stay home and probably read books anyways. So, yeah, there's that. But no, it's like in terms of Prague. I love Prague. I only spent a couple of days in Prague, but loved it. It was gorgeous, beautiful. I've never been to Poland, but I'm hoping that I get to go soon. Romania looks super interesting. I have a standing invite from somebody in Bulgaria. Like I have no problems. Could I move anywhere? Sure. I mean, I'll struggle. I'll muddle along with I'll speak whatever language I need to in a very typical English way, which is I'll just speak, English slowly and loudly, and of course everyone will be able to understand. So that's yeah. Kathleen Popescu, did I see the movie The Death of Stalin? Absolutely. The Death of Stalin is fantastic. I'm hoping and assuming that everybody has seen that. If you haven't, remedy that. Add that. Watch that before Chernobyl. To be honest, The Death of Stalin is just a fantastic film. It's funny. It's dark. It actually does really well with the history as well. There's liberties and things that they take in that, but it does really well with the history. And it's really, really well done. Yeah, that's no, I've absolutely seen The Death of Stalin, and it was fantastic. That's one of those movies that my wife did not like. She got up and left. So yeah. Let's see. An episode on U.S.-Soviet cooperation, positive competition. It's absolutely that we're working on something like that. The Apollo Soyuz is sort of the highlight. the high point of U.S.-Soviet competition. Sort of comes as détente had actually almost started scaling back by the time that the Apollo-Soyuz missions started happening. But because all the work for that to happen happened earlier, like that's sort of the culmination of it. Science is one of those really interesting things, like the language of science, where it doesn't matter what your ideology is, the science remains the same, as a common bridging ground between countries. There's some really interesting stories that come out of that. But yeah, no, absolutely. That's some of those cooperation moments. And I think that the Skopje earthquake sounds like actually like could tie into something like that really, really well as well. So that's a really interesting, it's a good comment, Indy. Thank you. That's why was Ceausescu so obsessed with paying off all debts? That's the first time that I've ever actually thought of that question. I'm not 100% sure what the real drive was there. I think a lot of it had to do with needing independence for Romania. Like, Romania remained in the Warsaw Pact, but was certainly the black sheep of the Warsaw Pact. Spoke out against Operation Danube and crushing Prague Spring. Ceausescu had closer relations to the Chinese than he probably did to Moscow, still inside the Warsaw Pact, mind you, but making sure that Romania was not tied down by any outside nations. I think that was a really big part of that. I would need to do a bit more digging into that to see where that driving force was coming from. But that was definitely a big factor in that, I think. So, let's see. Other questions. How are we doing here, guys? Am I just sort of rattling on here and everyone's bored, or are we good? I hope everybody's good. So let's. Oh, wow, James. James is coming up with some killer questions here. Have I considered narrating the Roma people's experience in various countries during the time? I haven't, actually. The experience, I think that I'm used to reading a lot of depressing stuff, but like the experience of the Roma and the Sinti peoples is just so, it's really depressing. It really highlights structural and systemic challenges. It isn't, that's marginalized people, like that there's a whole lot of things that come together there. I have to think about that. That's a good question, James. Thank you. Let's see what else we got. If you're bored, you'd leave, and you're still here. Okay, well, thank you. That's probably the winningest comment I've seen. What's the best car coming out of the Warsaw Pact countries? What's the best car, or what's my favorite car? I don't know. I don't know necessarily. Like, best car is tough. I mean, Skodas were always sort of rated okay. Ladas, like Muscovich, were like, to be honest, it's like they sold them here in Canada, especially the Niva, the Cossack, depending what it was called, where different names depending where you were. That was the sort of the SUV-ish 4x4. My favorite's always been the Trabant. Like the Trabant 601s are just these. It's just like, it's like what you can do with what looks like cardboard and some duct tape and a lawnmower engine. Pretty impressive. Everyone's going to have their favorite, the Maluch, the Fiat Polski. I love those little things. I actually helped pick one up and move one to a different parking spot once upon a time. There's great little things about all kinds of different cars that were coming out of the Eastern Bloc countries. The biggest thing about a lot of those cars that I find really interesting is that service stations weren't really a thing. Mechanics weren't really a thing. spare parts were difficult to come by. You did all your own repairs, and you kludged a lot of stuff together, and like, you almost made your own, like, repair parts and stuff. Really, really interesting. So those cars stayed simple. I'm not necessarily going to say that that's the reason that they stayed simple, but because they stayed simple, they didn't require a lot of, like, high-end infrastructure and whatnot happening in the background to be able to supply and support. The whole car thing is really interesting in the East Bloc. So let's see, what else do we got? Oh, here we go. Everyone in the comments are calling out what their favorite cars are. So Yugos, Ladas, Trabants. Yeah, there we go. I mean, that's after the Soviet-China split, who did Mongolia turn to for closer diplomatic relations? Moscow, 100%. Mongolia was absolutely a puppet, isn't the right word, but they were absolutely under Moscow's control. The black infamous KGB car is a Black Maria. That's like a Zeal or a Chaika. Those were pretty high-end, like, to be honest, they were relatively high-end cars. If you go back and take a look at what an average car in the 1950s or 60s looked like, and you compare them against what the Soviets were building at the high end in the 70s, I'm not going to say they're 100% comparable, but the gap isn't too wide. I think a lot of people, I'm going to go off on a little rant here for one quick second. There's definitely a thing in people's minds and in people's brains that have been imprinted in sort of common culture that living standards in the Soviet Union were substantial, and the East Bloc were substantially lower than they were in the West for the entirety of the Cold War. And that isn't true. Living standards didn't really start to, like, pull away and have a huge big gap developing between them, especially between the United States and the Soviet Union, but even within, like Western Europe and Eastern Europe, that really didn't start pulling away, and that gap started to form until the 70s. Prior to that, the living standards between, I think, your average person in the East Bloc and your average person in Western Europe could, especially working class, could be very similar. Live better in the West, but it wasn't like there was this tremendous gap between East and West. I think that's often forgotten about because the gap did widen so much through the 70s and especially the 80s. And that stagnation, that's all the result of stagnation and all those things. That certainly helped to bring an end to the Cold War. Let's see. Hi, I love you. Oh, that's the nicest thing everybody said to me all day. Thank you. I love you guys too. Have I been to the Diefenbunker? Yep, I've been to the Diefenbunker a few times. The Diefenbunker, for those who don't know, is a 1950s era Cold War bunker outside that was built outside of Ottawa. That was designed for the Canadian leadership to be able to withdraw to in the event of a nuclear attack. It was so secret that everybody knew it was there before it even opened. So, but yeah, I've been there a few times. Really interesting place if you're ever at, like, rural. Sorry, I'm just petting my dog who's just walked over here. If you're ever, like, sort of in the Ottawa area, Diefenbunker is absolutely worth going to and absolutely worth visiting. It's quite interesting. Who had more influence in the Middle East during the Cold War, the USSR or the West? It's a tough question because it depends when you're talking about, like when during the Cold War. Like, certainly the West had much more influence in the earlier half of the Cold War. The Soviets picked up, like, a significant amount of dog. Soviets picked up a lot more influences, like in places like Iraq and Syria. Later the Cold War went on. So it really does depend. I mean, and obviously Iran is another wild card that's involved in there as well, because Iran was a massively, massively staunch U.S. ally until the revolution happened. And then it wasn't an ally of either the Soviet Union or the United States, because obviously, like, it's like if you're going to set up a theocracy, you're not going to meld well with sort of the Marxist line that's being pushed from Moscow, or is supposed to be pushed from Moscow. That's I think the problems of corruption and incompetence in the Russian military revealed by current events in Eastern Europe were present throughout the Cold War. That's a really tough question. My impression is that yes, they were there. Certainly not to the extent that they've shown themselves in Ukraine as a result of the Ukraine war now. I think corruption, the Soviet Union, especially like into the 80s, the Soviet Union ran on corruption. Low key, low grade, but corruption. It wasn't selling 1.5 million winter coats. It was selling off 60 winter coats. It's that type of thing. Do I think it was present? Yes. Its existence in the late Soviet period, its prevalence, its pervasiveness in the late Soviet period, certainly wasn't checked or done anything about after the Soviet collapse. For a lot of people involved in anything, like that was the only way to get by in the 90s. That's become sort of ingrained in a lot of cultural aspects in life in Russia, in the Russian Federation, and a lot of the post-Soviet sphere overall, to be honest. I think it was there. I don't think it was quite as deeply rooted. If the question that you're asking or sort of like hinting at that you want to go for there is, had war broken out between the Soviets and the Americans, or the West at some point, would the same problems have manifested themselves? I think they probably would have manifested themselves, but on a much, much smaller scale than what you're seeing. Like, I don't think that you're going to see 30% of a tank park completely out of commission right from the start because they've all been cannibalized for parts. I don't think it was that bad. But I think there was always some degree of sort of low level corruption and incompetence that was involved. That's difficult. It's a difficult question because it really is sort of, it's guessing. It didn't happen. Like, it's like, do I think that possibility exists? Yeah, I do. I feel that would have been the case, but I don't. I mean, I have no proof to back that up. So that's was Andy Griffith a Soviet operative? I'm not sure if that's a joke or if I need to Google that and actually do some digging there, because that sounds like was Mayberry a Potemkin village? Like, what's the Tom? Give me some further detail on that. That sounds like either worth a good laugh or like something really worth digging into. That's it's a joke. That's too bad. That's that would have been fantastic. Michael, were the Polynesian Islands ever a significant factor during the Cold War? I don't know a ton about Polynesian history, but I would say that from what I know, the biggest role that the Polynesian Islands played during the Cold War was as a test ground to have nuclear, atomic and hydrogen bombs dropped on them. They were test grounds. That's the people of the Polynesian peoples and all the peoples of the South Pacific have been absolutely, in a lot of cases, and depending where you were, absolutely crapped on through the Cold War. People in Micronesia being forcibly removed from their homes, never to be able to be returned. That's I think it's often forgotten about that Polynesia did play a role. It wasn't necessarily that it was a battleground type thing, but they were a test ground. That's the role that they played. That's for anybody who's interested. I'd have to dig around. I'll try to post something in the comments afterwards. There was a really, really interesting book released not that long ago by an Australian journalist talking about looking at the role that Polynesia played, that the South Pacific basically played in the nuclear test programs. Really quite interesting. I can't think of the name of it right now. I haven't had the opportunity to read the book, but I will post up that recommendation after I finish this. So let's see. Just taking a look here. I had a couple of questions that came in for anybody who saw the links that I was sort of pushing on the social media a little bit. I was sort of opening things up in case anybody wanted to ask things via email, in case this wasn't a convenient time for people to join. Had a couple of questions that came in via email. First one asking if the Soviets had won. This is a question from Alex. If the Soviets had won in Afghanistan, would Wahhabism be dominant in the Middle East today? I couldn't tell you. If the Soviets had won, I mean, what does win even look like? Possibly, maybe not. I mean, that's one of those that is one of those counterfactuals. That really is. Would it play out exactly the way that it did? No, it wouldn't have. Could Wahhabism still have become a prominent aspect in the Middle East? Yeah, absolutely. It could have just been via a different method. So I don't want to say that. I can't answer that question, but it's an interesting question to pose. I would be more focused on what does it mean for the Soviets to win in Afghanistan. That would be I think that's an interesting line of questioning to go for. The other question I got was from Chris in the UK. How useful is the term Cold War when much of it was hot? And I think that's a really interesting question. We call it the Cold War. And it's, the idea that it was a war that was fought without being fought, except that we all know that wasn't true. The war was absolutely being fought. There was wars that were happening all over the damn place. Millions and upwards of 40 million people died as a direct cause of the Cold War, fighting in the Cold War. It wasn't Europeans, it wasn't Americans, it wasn't white people, basically, but millions of people died. So how useful is that term? I think it's a very loaded term. I think it's very much coming out of this idea that the people who have been writing the histories or the widespread histories and the acknowledged histories of this for the last 50 years have all come from countries and societies where the fighting wasn't predominant. If you were, if you're Korean, if you're Vietnamese, if you're Bangladeshi, if you're Afghani, it's there's countries that have been absolutely decimated. Not the Roman way. 1 out of 10. I get it. Not, that's before I sort of belabor the point. That's a really interesting question to be asked. What does it mean to be a Cold War versus a hot war? I'm going to get into book recommendations now. For anybody who's interested in that question, I very much recommend this book, which is probably backwards in the camera here. It's called and I'll post the link for it, but it's called The Cold War's Killing Fields, Rethinking the Long Peace by Paul Thomas Chamberlain. This is a phenomenal book. And he's basically looking at the war experience, the war chronology that happens in Asia. Doesn't even look at Latin America, doesn't even look at wars in Africa, but the absolute, and he's really looking and addressing that question about hot versus cold. Really, really interesting. So certainly for anybody who's interested, and again, I'll post that the title of it afterwards. So let's see. Who's my favorite Soviet? Now, do you mean, when you say Soviet historian, do you mean a historian who was a Soviet citizen? Or do you mean my favorite historian who looks at the period of the Soviet Union? Because those are two different things. That's Obras, how did South Africa get its nukes? South Africa had nukes? What are you talking about? South Africa never officially had nukes. We'll take a look at the Vila incident at some point. That's quite an interesting story. So, excuse me. That's I've been talking now for over an hour, and want to drink my tea. So, Do I believe that Stalin's leadership was a net positive or a net negative for the Soviet Union? If I say something negative against Stalin, then it's you get one group of people yelling at you. If you say something positive about Stalin, then you get a whole other group of people yelling at you. Do I think that Stalin's leadership saved the Soviet Union when it came to the prosecution of the Second World War? Yes, but the cost for that was immense. That's a cost in just 25 million lives, 25 plus 30 million lives. When you look at, it's not just the war dead, but when you look at, it's like the purges and the Holodomor and all of everything that happened under Stalin's leadership. There's a massive, massive cost. Did it save the Soviet Union? Likely. Was it worth it? I'm not the one to ask that question to. That's a hell of a question. That's somebody's trying to put me on the spot. This is recorded. I mean, this could end up going viral and I'm going to get canceled or something, but hopefully that's a sort of, a very historian-y kind of answer where I don't actually take a stand anywhere. So that's, let's see. What do I think of East German special forces using weapons from West Germany? Wouldn't Soviet ones be just as good, or is it more the GDR trying to stay German? I don't know enough about the topic. The first thing that springs to mind is the East German special forces. If they were, it depends what their role was. If they were going to be crossing into West Germany and causing havoc, then using West German weapons makes total sense. As anyone who uses, small arms and weapons knows, any kind of weapon really, they all have different sounds, and people who have been around them long enough can tell different weapons apart by their sound. If you're trying to cause havoc and chaos behind enemy lines, which is in a lot of ways what special forces are meant to be doing, using the enemy's weapons is a way to further sort of destabilize and increase that confusion. So that's just a speculative guess. I really don't know. If I'm onto something, great. If I'm completely off, completely wrong, then my apologies. So would the Red Army have been more effective if Stalin hadn't purged all of his top generals before the war? Maybe, probably, don't know. Never got the chance to find out. So, do I believe historians will call this era the Second Cold War? Cold War II, the return? I think, are we in a second? I get this question a lot, actually. Are we entering a second Cold War? I think we are entering all the right conditions for a second Cold War, but not the way that it's not going to be like the first one. The first one's done and dusted. This lacks, if we are entering one, it would be between the West and Russia. It's not going to involve China as a Cold War. If there's going to be a war that involves China, that's going to be hot. China holds everybody's money. China's too interconnected. I mean, that's one of the big things with the Cold War is that there wasn't like trade links. These were closed, two closed spheres from each other between the East and the West. We're entering that type of precondition with the situation with Russia. We're not seeing that with China. I don't know that we would see that with China. China needs money from the world, and the world wants things from China. There's a reliance of trade that happens there. And when there's a reliance on trade that happens, then you've got to be talking and negotiating to each other. Whether there's a power imbalance, that's something different. But I don't see this as necessarily being a Cold War involving China. With Russia, yeah, we're entering the right kind of conditions. whether that actually comes to pass over the long term, I don't know. That's let's see. Point of the Cold War is that it ended open warfare. Yeah, there's a question from Michael. Do I think the invention of nuclear weapons brought more peace to the world since there hasn't been any wars between major powers? It's funny. I was having this debate in class a couple of weeks ago. Nuclear weapons bringing peace. How much peace do you have if your actions are being controlled by somebody who's ready to punch you in the head? Like, is that peace? Is all that's required for peace, is that the absence of war, or is peace something more than that? I don't think that the invention of nuclear weapons has brought peace simply because there hasn't been war. I think the invention and the development and the proliferation, that is a word that just vexes me every time. The proliferation of nuclear weapons hasn't increased our levels of peace. It's only increased the levels of destruction that are going to happen if a war ever breaks out. And I think there's a fundamental difference between those two things. That's my own personal opinion. So, who's my favorite Soviet historian? Doctor specialized in USSR's history, as well as a citizen who lived in the USSR. Zubok. Vladislav Zubok is he's phenomenal. I've recommended his last book, Collapse, a number of times on here. But he is that's if you want a good understanding of the late Soviet period, read Zubok's work. Phenomenal work. He was a Soviet citizen. I was just listening to an interview with him the other day. He was actually transiting from the Soviet Union to the US to study when the coup happened. He was already he was a Soviet citizen, all those things. But phenomenal. It's like he was, in his 20s when, Soviet Union collapsed. So, he lived it, he saw it, and he's written about it since. Really excellent, if not slightly prickly kind of guy. But Zubok, excellent guy. I think the Cold War was basically bound to happen after the end of World War II, no matter what, or do I think it could have been avoided if one or the other had done something different? It's an interesting question. I think as long as Stalin was alive, something like the Cold War was going to happen. If Stalin had lived longer, I'm not sure how long. I don't necessarily know that Stalin had plans on global domination. But I think Stalin was much more willing to push the envelope, certainly than, as you saw with Korea and things like that. But I think I kind of do think that some kind of a Cold War was going to be inevitable. Was it one that was going to last 40 years? That I don't think anybody foresaw that. I think all the conditions existed and everything was coming together the way that it did. Could it have been avoided? Yeah, probably. But that would have likely have been some sort of even more catastrophic event than the Second World War. And ain't nobody got time for that. So, that's one man's opinion. So. What do I think of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and his Harvard address? He claimed both societies, Western and Eastern, are materialistic. Solzhenitsyn is a really interesting guy, and I've read a ton of Solzhenitsyn. Super interesting writer. and a really interesting background, like everything sort of to do with him. But there's something about Solzhenitsyn that's never sat well with me, and that's the degree of how nationalistic he, I don't know if necessarily became or was is the right term. Solzhenitsyn was absolutely like a Russian nationalist. Him and Dugin and Gumiev, like there's a few others that there's sort of this like this combination, and it's this swing away from, well, this is what socialism, this is what communism was. So everything the opposite of that has to be better, and the opposite of, as Solzhenitsyn saw it, like the opposite of communism was going to be extreme nationalism, and like this Russian mythos that gets built. And I have problems with that too. In terms of him claiming that both Eastern and Western societies are materialistic, I think humanity is more or less materialistic. Like we are biological creatures that want to gather, not hoarders, but like we want to gather the things around us that make us comfortable. And some people are more, it's like some people like IKEA type stuff, and some people like Victorian type stuff. Like it's all depends on sort of like what level of stuff that you, how much do you want. But I think to some degree, like it's like it's very rare to find people that it's like don't need anything. I mean, that's at that point you're a monk, and like it's like you're finding solace in something else, and it's like society sort of lauds people for doing that as being something different and being something special. So yeah, I mean, I think that people have a materialistic nature to them, to want security and protection of the things around them that make them comfortable. How credible is Sergei Khrushchev's reported history of his father? I've never read Sergei Khrushchev's works, so I would certainly take some of that with a grain of salt. It wouldn't be the first thing that I would be reading if you're planning to look in and read deeply into Khrushchev. Sergei Khrushchev is not going to be the first place to start. Get a really good. William Taubman did a biography on Khrushchev a number of years ago. That's excellent. Get into that first to like really get comfortable with everything, sort of like with a third party history, and then get into Sergei Khrushchev's works and take a look at that and see where the gaps are, where the dissimilarities are, and make up your own mind. That's what I can recommend. Why did the Soviets adopt the brutalist architectural style? It's cheap. It's concrete. It's poured concrete. It's cheap. It doesn't require a lot. You can prefab stuff, and it's cheap. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. When you've got millions of homes and millions of like square feet of building that you need to put up, and you need to put it up quickly, you want to do it cheaply. Brutalist, and it's not like the Soviets were the only people to have adopted brutalism as an architectural style. If you go to any university campus, for university buildings that were designed in the 60s and designed and built through the 60s and the 70s, it's brutalism everywhere. Like that's what it was. The city of Vancouver, a lot of these older buildings are getting knocked down because people think that they're damn ugly. But I mean, the city of Vancouver for a long time was like, high-rise buildings were very brutalist in nature. They were poured concrete. They were cheap, and they were the style at the time in a ton of different places, not just the Soviet Union. Yeah, that's. Let's see. What do I think is the next great event that's going to happen? Define great. I'll be honest. I'm just trying to make it to tomorrow, guys. Like that's. I don't want another great event. Like I've been like in the last 3 years, we've all been through enough damn great events. let's have a year without any events, and just like nice and calm and peaceful, and so we can all sleep like my dog back there. That's she's got the IQ of a turnip, so I mean she doesn't really have to think hard about things. But yeah, like that's I don't want to think about what the next great event is, because the next great event always means uncertainty and terribleness, and I just want a bit of a break right now. So yeah. Yeah, exactly, right, Charlie Gers? I'm really, really tired of great events. I think we're all really tired of great events. So that's we want to see a couple of book recommendations, some things that I've read in the last year that you guys might be interested in. I'm assuming everyone's like, for the 100+ of you or so that have been listening to me for like an hour and a half. Yeah, that's Mr. Thank you for wishing me a good break. I don't have a break right now. I'm doing a master's degree, and I have the next 3 weeks to write a couple of papers, so I don't really have a break. But yeah, that's. But thank you. I appreciate the sentiment. So, couple of books that I've read. I'm not going to say necessarily that these are the best things that I've ever read and that you should go and read them. Just a couple of things that I've read that I found interesting that you guys might like. A lot of people have read this. I'm sure it's Anna Funder's Stasiland. This is taking. Oh, there we go. Just taking a look at recollections of life in the Stasi-controlled East Germany. The book, it has its critics, but it's an interesting read. Pretty easy. Pretty light reading. It's nothing dense. It's nothing like it's. I'm not going to say it's toilet reading either, but yeah, it's a decent book. Well worth your time. If you haven't read it, certainly worth your time to pick it up. I may have recommended this one in the past, Burning Down the House by Tim Moore. This is about East German punk and the role played by East German punks and punk music through the 80s, leading to the fall of the wall. The book certainly overplays basically the book sort of makes this presupposition that like if it wasn't for punk music that the wall would still be there. But that aside, like it never actually says that, but I think it very much overstates the role of punk music, but it's really interesting to see some of the relationships that are being talked about in it between how the authorities dealt with people in East Germany. Interesting book, really interesting. If you like punk music and sort of, the subversive underground, interesting book. That's let's see. Derusio, Sleepwalkers by Stephen Kotkin. Was Sleepwalkers written by Stephen Kotkin? I haven't read Sleepwalkers, but I mean, I know the argument in it. I don't. Anyways, that's again. I did a whole bunch of stuff on the origins of the First World War, etc. Anyways, that's no. I haven't read Sleepwalkers. Obviously, this one is very, very prescient in terms of, and this really has. I'm going to say it has nothing to do with the Cold War because it does have a lot to do with the Cold War, but it's very much like the Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. For anybody who hasn't read this, if you're at all interested in what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Russia-Ukrainian relations, how all of this fits together, this is the book to read. This is the book to read. Everybody should read this. Like, there's clarity that will come from reading this in terms of what's happening in Eastern Europe right now. Arthrofuturism. it covers the Holodomor. It talks about, he goes into all of that. He goes into, Stepan Bandera, like all of these things. There's no, clean cut black and white anything. It really, it's a phenomenal book. It is absolutely phenomenal work. Timothy Snyder's done an amazing job. If there is a book that you guys are going to read, maybe wait till the new year, but let's let the holidays finish. But if you haven't read it, you need you want a good understanding of what's happening in Eastern Europe, that is the book to read, 100%. And yeah, there's Patrick is mentioning in the comments that he's read it and it was one of the most emotionally draining things that he's ever read. It 100% is. It is incredibly draining. Yeah, that's another one. If anyone wants a follow-up, Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler by Robert Gellately. This isn't quite as, it's going earlier, like it's very much starting from the 20s, sort of with Lenin coming into power. But this is also really excellent. There's some overlap with what Timothy Snyder has written in Bloodlands, but it is excellent. Really strongly, highly recommend. Yeah, those are. And finally, I picked this up. It's called Her Cold War by Tanya Roth, Women in the U.S. Military from 1945 to 1980. And it is basically, it's a history of the role of women in the U.S. military from the end of the Second World War through to their acceptance as equal people in 1980, like as full like soldiers. With equal rights and equal equality in the military. Really, really interesting book. And definitely not the story I was expecting. Women were absolutely involved and encouraged from the late 40s and the early 50s to join the military, but there's very specific pieces that all fit together. Really, really interesting. Excellent book. Highly recommend. Her Cold War. I will post all of these recommendations in the comment on the video. So for anybody who, if you didn't have a pen or paper, didn't write this down, like type it in your phone or whatever, that's I will certainly send that along in case anyone's interested. So, and there's lots and lots of people like making comments about books and all kinds of things. Yeah, that's how we doing here. I've been talking for an hour and a half, and I need to take my dogs out to go for a walk before we're supposed to be getting some sort of a winter storm ish here. Yeah, so that's I really do need to take my dogs out at some point before that really starts. I don't think we're going to be getting the severe cold that other parts of North America are going to be getting, but we're supposed to get ice and rain, which is always lovely. So were dogs popular pets in the Soviet Union? I'm assuming, I don't know, actually. I've met very few Europeans in general, but Eastern Europeans that didn't like dogs. They've all, like every Russian that I've ever met and spent time with loved dogs, whether they had them as pets. I'm assuming they probably would have, yes, but it's a great question. Actually, I'm not sure how I even I don't even know how I pull that kind of data. Would I do a video about Christmas in the Soviet Union? Nope, can't do a video on Christmas in the Soviet Union because Christmas in the Soviet Union didn't officially exist. Christmas didn't exist in the Soviet Union. It did, but Christmas wasn't the big thing. It was New Year's, and New Year's just turned into a 2-week celebration. So it encompassed Christmas and it encompassed New Year's, and it just sort of replaced stuff. Yeah. So I mean, it's like, was there Christmas officially? Not in an atheist state. But I mean, the traditions were there. the time, like people taking time, like all those things, spend time with your family, like all those things. So yeah, I mean, it's yeah, that's I spent a Christmas in Moscow in the mid 90s. That was the coldest I think I've ever been in my life, but that's yeah, that was an experience. Interesting city. Um, lots of people like tossing out questions, and that's seems like many cultures find a way to reinvent Saturnalia. It's just because Saturnalia got there first. Like it, people look for a day off. People look for a reason to celebrate, whether it's the celebration of the birth of a prophet, a religious prophet, whether it's it's like the vernal equinox, the vernal, like the winter solstice. Like what people look to find reasons to have a holiday and to celebrate and to spend time with those around them that they care for. That's that's the reality of it. Like it's find me a society that doesn't have holidays like that. Um, yeah, like that's a thing. Like this isn't just about it's like oh well, so we took Christmas and we replaced it with something else. There's a reason that people do that. So yeah, that's um yeah, I mean, on that note, someone's saying that my dog's going to take a dump in the house. Probably not, but just in case, I'd rather, that didn't happen. Um, I'm going to sign off for 2022. Obviously, we still have two more videos coming this year. We've got books. So I've got books. I'm sorry, I'm reading comments and whatnot. Yeah, I'm going to sign off for 2023. We've got two more videos coming. One Saturday, obviously, and one on the following Saturday, which would be Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, respectively. I would just like to say thank you very much to everybody out there, whether you're watching this live right now, whether you're watching this, after the fact. I can't do this without you guys. This is a labor of love. It's my job, but it's a labor of love. I really enjoy this type of thing. I would like to wish everybody out there a happy, safe, and festive, holiday season over like what's kind of happening now and over the next couple of weeks. Take time for yourselves. Take time to spend with your loved ones. Look after each other. Check up on people. It's a great time to check up on people you haven't talked to in maybe a long time. Just sort of reach out and say, hey, yeah. Be better for society. I think this has been a really tough year for a lot of people. A lot of tough times happening in a lot of different places. If you have things to spare, find a charity that you believe in, that you enjoy, donate, work with them. Be better people. We can all be better people. It costs us nothing. And that's the last bit that I'm going to berate you for 2022. I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year, and we'll see you guys all again in 2023. Take care, everybody.